Friends, I welcome you to this video in which I am going to start a series of Bible study on Paul's letter to the Galatians. Paul's letter to the Galatians is one of the most important letters of Paul. Among the modern scholars, there is a great amount of consensus that this letter has been written by Paul the Apostle himself. That's why Galatians is considered as one of the 7 undisputed letters of Paul. Although it is a very short letter, it has played very important role in the history of Christianity. Especially during the Reformation time, Martin Luther used letter to Galatians to articulate the doctrinal position of the church, Protestant church, and then he used it to propagate the idea that he was trying to bring out to the rest of the world in Europe. In fact, Luther's effort in studying Galatians has become a blessing for us even in the modern times, that we could recognize that Paul's understanding of justification by faith is very important. If not, it is the center of Paul's thinking. It forms a very important part in Paul's understanding. Letter to Galatians is not sent to a particular church, like we may say it is sent to a church in Corinth or in Philippi, but letter to Galatians must have been an encyclical letter which has been sent to be read in different churches that were formed in the region of Galatia. Now, there is a great unanimity that Paul has written this letter, and it is an undisputed letter of Paul. But there is a great dispute about this letter, that who were the readers, to whom was it at first sent. Traditionally, the church maintained that Paul wrote this letter to the people who were living in the northern part of Galatia. But then in the modern time, scholars have come up and argued that no, it is written to the people who were living in the southern part of Galatia. So those who support the northern part of Galatia and readership of the people who lived there, this is known as North Galician theory, but the people, those who support the South Galician readership, we call it as South Galician theory. Now, in the actual interpretation of Galatians, whether it is North or South Galatia, it does not make any big difference. However, to be accurate historically in our understanding of who the readers must have been of Paul's letter to the Galatians, this debate is very important. I personally believe that Paul wrote it to the South Galician region, to the churches that he founded during his first missionary journey. He went around preaching during his first missionary journey. As far as Luke's testimony is concerned, he went to Lystra, Derbe, Pisidian Antioch. This was the area where Paul had worked at first. And Paul must have written this letter to this particular group of people. The reason is this: we do not have a clear historical evidence that Paul had gone to the northern part of Galatia inhabited by the Galatian tribe, the tribe of Gauls. We do not have that. But the southern region was known during the Roman time as province of Galatia, and probably Paul was using this political nomenclature to address to these South Galician readers as Galatians. Traditionally, scholars have argued that Galatians were often thought of as foolish, but then that argument is not very convincing, because foolishness cannot be generalized for all the people of a tribe, nor it can be uniquely used as a characteristic of a particular group. Hence, I believe, along with many other scholars, that South Galicia must have been the place where Paul's readers were staying at this moment. If so, then when did Paul write this letter? Paul must have written this letter somewhere around AD 50 or 51. That means, to me, this letter forms one of the earliest letters of Paul, written sometime very close to the time when Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians and then he wrote 2 Thessalonians. So it is immediately after the incident that is mentioned in Acts chapter 15, that is Jerusalem Council, that Paul comes, and as he moves out in his second missionary journey, that he realizes that some have gone around and preached a different gospel, a gospel based on some Jewish cultural elements and imposing those teachings upon them as essential part of the gospel of Christ. And Paul is trying to resist that part and then saying that that is not the true gospel. True gospel is what has happened in the death and resurrection of Christ. In the death and resurrection of Christ, God was actually paving way for the salvation of humanity or the redemption of humanity from this evil age. So Paul is trying to tell that some who have gone around preaching the wrong gospel have tried to misguide the people in Galatia, but as Paul has gone to them first with this gospel of Christ, they must listen to him because he has the pure gospel that he has received at the time of revelation on the way to Damascus. So Christ has revealed this gospel to him, and that is what he is preaching to the people now. So who were the opponents? Some of the scholars have argued that these are Jewish Christian Gnostics, or people who believed in the secret knowledge, that they were the problem creators in Galatia. Well, that is an old theory which is rejected. Some others have argued that no, there were some people who were spreading false teachings, and other side there were some others who were teaching them a libertine form of life, that once you are saved, how you live is not important. But this two-front theory of opponent's identity is again not acceptable to us. The reason is simple, because there is no evidence in Paul's letters that there were two groups of people. So the generally accepted theory of the opponent's identity in Galatians is that they were probably Jewish Christian Judaizers who were going around in Pauline churches among the Gentiles, telling them that to be a better Christian, you need to undergo circumcision, obey table fellowship rules and regulation, what we call as kosher laws, and you must abide by the Sabbath laws. So if you do that, you will be a better Christian. Now Paul is opposing that. To some extent, this identity of Judaizers, Jewish Christian Judaizers, as of the opponents who were creating problem in the church, is established by Paul's unique mention of his confrontation with Peter in Antioch, and some people who come from James trying to spy the freedom of the believers in Galatia. Now, this is the general scenario in which we must understand Galatians. What matters now is, why did Paul write this letter? The purpose of the letter is very important for us. The purpose must have been that he wanted to correct the Galatian believers of the wrong type of teaching that was spreading among them, and make sure that they were faithful to the purity of the gospel which he had imparted to them during his mission trip to them, and they continue to uphold that. He did not want them to be burdened by the Jewish cultural elements and subsume their faith under these cultural practices, because salvation is not by cultural practices that one performs. Rather, salvation is by faith in Christ Jesus, and that is important for Galatians to recognize. For him, Galatians returning back to these cultural elements is returning back to the elementary spirits to which they had earlier submitted themselves. Hence, the result of their acceptance of the right form of the gospel requires them to abide by certain ethical principles. And that is what in chapter 5 he summarizes as the fruit of the Spirit. And every Christian is supposed to bear that fruit in his Christian life and put to death the deeds, the works of the flesh. So, Paul concludes in chapter 6 with this purpose, saying that I have written this short letter to you with my own hand, and you do not be circumcised in your flesh, rather let this circumcision be in your heart, as he speaks in Romans also. So whether you are circumcised or not circumcised, it is immaterial. What matters is your right standing in Christ Jesus and your faithfulness to the purity of the gospel. I believe this short introduction to Galatians will help us in the days to come to meditate more deeply upon each words of Paul in the letter to the Galatians.